You're listening to the Missionary Perspective Podcast with veteran missionaries Erik Johnson and Joshua Mead. We're glad you could join us. We trust this podcast will be both a blessing and a challenge as we relate topics in world evangelism from a missionary perspective. Now, here's Josh and Erik. Welcome back to the Missionary Perspective Podcast. We're glad you can join us today, and I hope you're having a blessed week. Last week, we had to skip a week. I was traveling, and we just couldn't make that connection there, Erik. I do have an interview with my good friend Daniel Jenkins that I still have to edit and get that posted. I'm excited about that one. And I hope if you're listening today, I hope you tuned into the Ron Bragg interview. That was such a blessing. He had such a tremendous impact in our life personally. And I know in missionaries all over, I think every missionary would probably be in Africa because of Ron Bragg. But I mean, there's, you got to follow God's calling. But if it was up to him, you'd be in Africa serving, he's just such a great man. And it was really good to connect with him. So I hope you go back and listen to that. Be sure to tune in. But we are talking, Erik, about finances, ministry, with a missionary perspective specifically. And I think today we wanted to cover the topic of the early days of mission work. So deputation, raising support, preparation, how important it is to do finance. And Erik, let me ask you, when you started Deputation, now you already were working a job, and so you already had kind of an idea how to budget, how to approach that. So let's talk the two perspectives, because I went in cold turkey having worked a job but never really budgeting or thinking about that. So tell us your perspective going in, and then how the transition from the business world to Deputation. What were some of the things you had to do to transition to be a wise steward of your finances?
Well, I'm sure every missionary has different experiences. It is true that I'd worked in the computer analysis sector. I worked for Sprint Communications, was a network analyst. And so I had, during my college years, I did my college at night. It's also worked for a mortgage company. So I was used to, like you said, living by a budget, paying bills, things like that. But I wasn't married yet. So that was a whole nother ball of wax, and my wife and I remember taking my final exam and then going to my wedding rehearsal, and we got married the next day. When we met you guys, it was a week before we got married. We were actually approved by BIMI a week before we got married. So pretty much life as a missionary started also with marriage. And so we had a few months where we were getting things ready for Deputation. But I would say for me, anticipating that time frame, we talked to a lot of missionaries, got some ideas. Obviously, when we were approved by BIMI, they give you a lot of training in-house with some ideas what to expect. But I'd say, and we kind of talked about this a little bit a few weeks ago, that idea that maybe even anxiety in some sense of that stepping out by faith when you stop working, when you stop having an inflow of resources and understanding, how am I going to budget for the future here? Because I don't have any promises save my home church in support that's going to come in. And for us, to be honest, that is one of the blessings, and we have many from our home church. They did prorate a little bit of our support ahead of time so that we wouldn't be nearly as worried about maybe if we still had an apartment. In that case, we did a few months of rent. Very soon after that, though, we gave up that apartment and we're really nomads. Now, we could do that because it was just my wife and I. But, we want to give our perspective, our experiences, but we also want to understand as we go through some of these things we're going to talk about in the next couple episodes that it really isn't necessarily a one size fits all. But in our experience, making that transition was a little more difficult in the sense of how is it going to go? My advice is this. I know there's two different kind of schools of thought. One is, and like I said, this kind of depends on your situation. Some people can't just go cold turkey, give up a job, and go full-time on Deputation. But I will say this, if you can make Deputation your full-time job, meaning you're spending pretty much every waking hour working on either contacting churches, investigating and checking out and seeing where you want to go, talking to other missionaries, calling churches, lining up meetings, going to meetings. If you can make Deputation your full-time job, I've seen almost in every example where the Lord not only provides in abundance so you can get to the field in a reasonable amount of time. The people I've seen in most cases where they kind of did the half and half, they worked half time and they kind of half at it, going to meetings, we might call it part time. It usually doesn't go nearly as fast. And now some of that may be a circumstance, and we understand that. But if you can, if the Lord has called you, you need to step out on faith. That's kind of how we started. It was some anxiousness to it, but the Lord greatly blessed.
Yeah, in all my studies of scripture, I've really come to understand, and I mean, it's been proven in our experience, but it's based on the testimony of the scriptures, especially the Apostle Paul, obviously the teachings of Jesus, the principles of the Old Testament. But when Paul says, "My God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus," he's talking about spiritual need. He's talking about physical need. He's talking about your financial need. And one thing I've learned as in experience, it's confirmed it, but when you're called to ministry, you're set apart, right? The Apostle Paul constantly defined himself as, I'm set apart for the gospel ministry. And if you read the New Testament and you see it in the Old Testament with the Levitical priesthood, what you discover is that faith, okay, stepping out by faith, it's not a blind faith of where's it going to come from. God, as you look at the scriptures, God has obligated himself to provide for those he calls. If God separates you to his work, he's not obligated to take care of me. I'm his creation. I'm obligated to obey him. But the wording of scripture is such that God has obligated himself, which means he will fulfill it. He will provide. Now, that doesn't mean he might provide the way you want him to. The Apostle Paul said in Philippians, I've learned how to be abased. I've learned how to abound. I've learned to suffer need. God is going to allow you to go through specific circumstances financially to stretch your faith, to try your faith, and to mold you to completely trust in him. And deputation is a good time, but I recommend to young men and women, married couples, but if you are younger and you know God has called you, start to learn to depend on God. I learned this from Hudson Taylor's biography. Learn to depend on God before you step out on deputation, and there's kind of that uncertainty of financial provision. When I was working a job as a teenager, I read the Hudson Taylor biography, how he wanted to intentionally strengthen his faith to prove that God would provide for him even when he had provision. So he would give his paycheck and things like that. And God was there to provide every step of the way. And we've proven that. I know you've proven that. God takes care of you. So when you step out by faith on deputation, I agree. If you don't do it right away, it does have to come early. If you have a family, you're working a job, at some point early on, you need to cut that off and say, God's called me. He's going to take care of me. I'm going to put the work in. I'm going to be in the churches, or it's going to be hard work, but God will take care of me.
I'm just remembering now because I'm old and I sometimes forget things. There was a transitional time once the Lord called me, and I was going to college and local Bible Institute in the evenings, and I was getting my degree, where my job with the Sprint Communications ended because they were laying off a lot of people. And I had the opportunity to continue in that field, which paid very well, or I had the opportunity to go another route, which would pay far less, but provided me the opportunity to finish my studies a lot quicker, less stress. And I'll just say there's a temptation, even with just every human being, of greed and money. But I remember I had a job offer at a job that I probably would have taken and made a lot more money, but it would have affected the speed of completing my task to go be a missionary. And I remember praying about this and probably even slowed down the point where I could have gotten married and provided for my family. But I remember thinking, if this truly is God's calling, I need to make every decision based on this calling and getting me to this point, even if it means I'm going to live on far less. And, the Lord provided, but like you said, I learned at that point, okay, I have enough to pay my rent. I have enough to feed myself. I have enough to pay my insurance, pay my, car, gas, things like that. But there wasn't a lot of excess. And I knew that making this decision would prepare me for being a missionary one day. And that is, just like you said, God will provide these opportunities to teach you to learn to live by faith even before you get to the mission field, to prove himself so that you can take the next step of faith.
Right. And so have that faith, cultivate that faith, learn to, you're depending on God. It's based on God's promises. And so you're not just blindly stepping out. You know God is going to provide. And it can be scary at first. I was young enough. We were just out of Bible college. I had worked jobs. I was just in a church conference, and we had a forum where missionaries and church planners were on the platform, and they did a Q&A. And one of the questions was, how can parents best prepare their children if God calls them into ministry, and specifically into missions? So, like, is there something a parent can do to better prepare their kids? Wow. And I thought about that.
Great
okay,
question.
I knew when I was a kid, I knew when I was 14, I was going to be a missionary to Africa. So I thought, okay, what lessons did my parents teach me? Because they weren't in ministry. We went faithfully to church. My grandpa was a pastor. My grandma had prayed that one of her grandkids would become a missionary, and that was an answer to God's call. And so I was reflecting on, okay, what did my parents how did their influence help me to live on a mission field, on a foreign field? And I think that the three takeaways I got as I was kind of analyzing what my parents taught me was, number one, common sense. I like what the pastor said when I said there's three things that, as a parent, if you can instill this in your kids, they'll be successful in whatever they do, but it will help tremendously in the mission field. Common sense, and that carries over in how you handle yourself with money. A hard work ethic, have character and a work ethic. And be a wise financial, teach them to steward their finances wisely. If you do those three things, and they're intertwined, right? Those three things are interconnected. Mm-hmm. But if you teach those three things to your children, and I like what the pastor said, he said, hey, and if you don't have common sense, then get under the influence of somebody who does, because, not everybody does. And so I look back at my mom and dad. From my dad, I got a hard work ethic. He provided for our family. We were poor. We didn't have a lot of money, but he worked hard. He provided for us. He never complained about it. He just dug in and did the work. And so I learned, all right, you got to work hard. You got to earn it. You got to have that work ethic, and the Bible supports that. And then common sense. Just both my parents, but especially my mom, just teaching common sense about how to behave, how to act around people, and just don't be stupid. Okay, and then wise financial stewardship, because we were poor. I remember going to school, and we paid. Lunches was $1.50. We paid 90 cents. I was the only one in our school, because most of the kids who went to our Christian school, their parents were wealthier. So I was the only one in school paying 90 cents. I thought, look at these losers. They got to pay $1.50. I only got to pay 90 cents. Not really realizing it's because we were in a poor bracket. But it never crossed my mind. But the reason is because my mom was so good with money that it never felt like we were poor. You know what I'm saying? Like, she was so wise with money, and she taught us how to budget and be wise. And so I would say, prepare yourself. If you're in college, you want to be a missionary, and you're like, oh man, I have no idea about money. Now, I never sat down and budgeted. I never I'm not a numbers guy. So that's why I'm so grateful that my parents instilled wise financial stewardship, because I just never intentionally sat down. It was already there, if that makes sense. And so when we started Deputation...
learn how to live within your means.
Exactly. A lot of us live beyond our means. And I think once you learn to... In fact, there's a message that I'll teach on Faith Promise missions. And when you go to that passage in Philippians... especially true, anybody can live this out, but it's especially true for the missionary. That phrase, live within your means, is an important phrase, but grace giving and learning to live by faith, you could take it to another level, which means learning to live within your need, not just your means, but your need. And when you learn, what do I need? There's so few things. There's a lot less you need in life. that we live within our means, but there's excesses within our means that we don't need. That makes sense. So as a missionary,
Absolutely.
learn to live within your need. And I think once you start to break down what you actually need to survive day to day, it's not that much, you know. Now let's get into though. Once you start Deputation, there are expenses that begin to add up. And so, what do you recommend? Let's say, you know, you're married, you have kids, and God called you into ministry. You've surrendered. You've got a job. Like, do you have a point? Do you just say, just go cold turkey? Or should you have meetings scheduled and have a strategic plan? What part of that faith of stepping out has to do with how strategic you are in your planning for your scheduling and making sure you're having meetings? Because one thing I learned, and then I'll let you can share your thoughts. One thing I learned was, okay, God provides for my needs. But then as I began doing ministry, I looked back and say, oh, wait a second. God provides for my needs, but he uses people to meet those needs. So there are people sacrificing and giving. So the money's coming from somewhere. It's not just magically falling from heaven. God is using people. And in order to see God provide through people, you need to you have to work hard with your scheduling, make connections, go to the churches. And so just what are your thoughts on that as a family? You know, it's easier if you're just married, no kids, to just say, let's do it. Let's get in the car and go. But if you do have a family,
Right.
What would you say to somebody struggling with that decision? When do I quit my job?
So we've had the opportunity as being veteran missionaries, Josh and I both, to host people who are taking survey trips, considering these kinds of questions. So we've talked to a lot of people, even though we have our experience where we started much younger and without families. We do understand this because we've seen people who have asked us these questions. My personal experience, and now through over the years, this is what I believe. Number one is the Bible talks about before you build a torre. I'm thinking in Spanish now. Before you build a tower, you're gonna count the cost. And so, as we talked about all these wise steps, part of it is understanding. And so, I do think it's a little bit unwise to just jump out on faith if you haven't talked to other missionaries. You have an idea what it's going to cost to go on deputation, what the next year or 2 years will look like financially. There is a preparation. I think there's a wisdom in that. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, you've got all that worked out. You've talked to veteran missionaries. You know the board you're going with. You know what the expenses you're going to kind of probably incur in the next couple of years. Expectation levels. You have that kind of taken care of, and that takes some time. There is the step of faith, and in my case, and this has been the case when we've bought properties here in the mission field. This was the case when we went on deputation. My wife and I, we kind of had a plan. We were going to go work part-time and do the part-time thing. And you know what? The mortgage company I was working with, they started laying people off too. And it was this sign, like, we're like, well, should we just go ahead and start deputation full-time? That same evening was missions conference at our church. And it was like within 4 months is when we wanted to start full-time. And Pastor Sisk preached a message on saying out 4 months into the harvest, you know, and we were just like, you know, the Lord couldn't have wrote it down on a piece of paper more clear for us. It was time to start deputation that day, full time. And so I don't know if the Lord's going to make it that clear to you, but I honestly believe he will. I think if you're going forward motion, you're going towards his will, you're doing the wise steps of planning and preparing, because especially when you have a family, you want to be very wise. You want to, because the Lord calls you to provide and take care of them. But there's also this great element of faith and being sure of your calling. And so those two, there will be anxiety, but that's where we lay our cares upon the Lord, and we wait for him to show himself mighty in not only provision, but direction. And don't be afraid to follow the Lord. But I honestly, that was my experience. We could talk all day long on different big decisions, but when you've taken the time to investigate, pray about, and you feel it's the Lord's will, and you wait on him, he usually opens the door and shows it pretty clearly.
And I'll tell you, there's nothing more exciting than when you're on deputation and the resources are limited and
Mhm.
an unexpected expense comes up, you need $700 to pay this bill, you don't know where it's coming from, and somebody hands you a check, you open the envelope and it's $700. It's the exact amount. I cannot tell you how many times God has done that, especially when we were on deputation, just seeing God provide the exact amount time and time again. And it's just it's a time of when you step out by faith. Like I said, God has obligated himself to care for the people he calls. You know, what's the phrase you always hear? Who he calls, he'll prepare, or to send, but he'll also provide
Yep.
for it. He will provide your needs, but you do have to be, strategic about it, wise about it. Take in a lot of wise counsel. Now let's say you've stepped out now by faith. You're on the road.
Mhm.
Something happens, probably maybe a year or two into your travels, that you begin to see your support level rising, and you're getting love offerings as well. And I'll say this for any young couple or any couple at all, if you're raising support right now, there's no reason to not have a full schedule. Because I just got an email this week from a very large church, a mega church that supports it. I get mega church. It's a large church. And they asked if I had any recommendations of missionaries for their October mission conference. Like, that's coming up. Like, usually you have it full. And pastors are telling me that I'm not getting as many calls from missionaries. And so I'm telling you, there's no excuse to not have a full schedule. You can get it done. You might have to travel a little more. You might have to go where the meetings
Yep.
are. Go out west. There's a lot of churches
Yep.
out there that would have you out there. So you can be strategic, find out, okay, where are, out west. We were just in Colorado, and they don't get a lot of missionaries coming out to that area. Go out there, especially if you're young, you don't got a family, you're more flexible. It's just you and your wife, or maybe you
Mhm.
got two kids. And I understand there's there's
Mhm.
there's some difficulties and there's challenges, especially if you have a young family, to the travel. But I got to take care of you. Now, where I wanted to transition to is you're about a year into it. You're about a year and a half into deputation, and your support level's going up, and at the same time you're still getting love offerings. Now you're starting to say, oh, I'm kind of more than even what I need is coming in. What do I do with this excess money? What is your right? Was there a time in your raising support that you're like, oh, I actually have more, like I have more than what I need right now to continue maintaining
Mhm.
deputation. What do I do with this money?
Well, yes, yes. I mean, the simple answer for our case was yes. One of the reasons for that was we were able to give up our apartment very early on in the process, pretty much in the beginning, and stay with family or friends along the way. Now, once again, this is very hard to do sometimes if you have two, three, four kids, and we understand that. So this is not a one size fits all. But what I would say is along the way, and Josh and Julie are very good at this as well, being as frugal as possible and looking for areas to cut the costs of things that just sap your money, which is like rent or mortgage, things like that. As soon as you can take those major things off the table and you can reinvest them into your traveling costs, and then once those are covered, like Josh mentioned, and going to different meetings, then you want to start socking it away, because I guarantee you what you think is going to be, let's say, something that gets become 5, 10, $15,000, which sounds like an enormous amount. Trust me, when those first few weeks and months on the mission field, you will deplete that ASAP. So my thing is save, 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 because the need is coming very quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And I would say as you start to see that budget increasing and you have some excess funds, nowadays there's a lot of places you can put that money that's accessible, but it's at least
Mhm.
making a little more interest. So we
High
did.
yield savings.
Yeah, so we didn't have this when I was traveling, but you can open up
No.
there's a Charles Schwab has an online account you can open. I think they're 4.5 interest, high yield. I just Robinhood app, you can put your money there.
Yeah.
If you
Most
pay, I
most
think it's a
banks like
month.
Capital One, if you just have a bank
Yeah,
account, you can get 4.5 to 5% just parking your cash for now. That'll
Yeah.
probably
So make
change
sure
in
you're
next year.
Yeah, exactly. So make sure you're punting it somewhere where it's not risking that budget because you will need it those first couple years.
Yep.
But put it somewhere where if it's going to sit there for 2 or 3 years, you're at least getting some interest off it at a higher rate than
Absolutely.
just a local bank that's not producing much
Exactly.
interest. And so yeah, that's again just being wise with that. Continue to be frugal. I would say stay as frugal. So the first few months of deputation, maintain that frugality. Is that a word? Frugality. Maintain that.
Yeah.
Even when you're at 90% support, plus you're getting love offerings at each church, maintain that same initial frugalness as that budget is increasing, because like Erik said, you're going to need that budget when you move to the field easily within the first few months of arriving to the field. And prior to arriving, you'll be spending 20, 30K, even more if you're getting a vehicle, you're importing. You'll blow through 50K just like that your first year. And so you should easily be able to save, on deputation, at least 20 to 25K. That's what I would say. I don't know what it is today. That's what we were able to save.
Yeah, and one of the things I wanted to mention as well is that, Josh, when you and I get the opportunities to, I just how to explain this, the technology, the ability to find deals, to find rewards programs, all those things, they didn't really exist. I mean, we had coupons, but this idea of using your time to find ways to save massive amounts of money is more present now than ever before. And so I would say that just taking a little bit of time to assess your situation. I remember you did this, if I'm not mistaken. You guys would eat like 2 meals a day, and you'd have like one big meal, and you guys saved tons of money doing things like that. So I never went that route, and I can prove that. But there's all kinds of different ways that you can think of to help save money, because trust me, you're going to need it. And it's something that you have to do. You need to do it.
I agree. Well, there's so much more we could cover about deputation and finances. And if you're listening and you're either raising support or maybe you're looking at becoming a missionary, we'd love to hear questions, and we could try, to cover if there's something we're not thinking of right now. But as I reflect back on deputation and raising support, it was a time for me to start to understand kind of how money and finances is a tool for the ministry. For me, just the way I grew up and the way my personality was, I'm not a numbers guy. I'm not like a business person. And so money to me was almost just this abstract concept of, I don't know. It just wasn't something that clicked. My wife, on the other hand, she grew up a little bit poor as well, but was just a hard worker and was very frugal. But money for her was a thing like you have to be very intentional with it. And so she lived her life. She was a teacher for a while, and as a single young girl, she was able to maintain, sustain herself, but still wasn't a large salary. And so when we got married, there was a little bit of fear and trepidation stepping out by faith, just, well, where's the money going to come from? But then as time went on, she was a balance to me, and you need to learn each other's strengths and weaknesses, because my personality is, let's just give it all away and God will provide even more next time. And that's good. If God lays it on your heart to give everything away, do it, follow God's leading. But that's not, you can't sustain a ministry by just, you get a support, you give it all away. And so Julie was a good balance to me to see the reality of what money is, right? It's kind of hard for me to explain it, but to me, money was kind of an abstract concept. It was just, I didn't really wrap my mind around it and needed to be able to budget. I needed to learn how to, hey, once we got it, because now we're raising support like $250,000 for this building project, 150, almost 145, I think, or something like that has already come in. And these are big numbers that, to God, it's nothing. He provides for it. It's an incredible thing. But for me, it's like, okay, I got to be wise. Like, I don't want to mess up with how I'm budgeting this, making sure I'm spending it wisely. My wife was a huge help with that. because she was a little more nervous. Well, let's make sure we're cutting these costs. And so she was the saver. She was the deal finder. Even on Deputation, we'd go into Goodwills or we'd garage sale in every city we were at. She'd buy stuff, take it back, resell it. So she always had this little side gig going on just to make sure it didn't take away from ministry, but she always had a little bit of side income coming in. And so play to each other's strengths and weaknesses if you're married, and just learn that money is a tool to glorify God. And it's a way we partner with churches, and it's a way we reach people on the mission field. It's not the only way, but it is an essential tool that's needed. And so learn to be a wise steward.
As we finish here, we're actually in missions month in our church, and we have been talking about, because tomorrow, 2 days from now, we host another mission group to do some construction work in one of our church plants. And I was explaining to our church, the more we are generous, the more we are willing to give of our resources to the Lord. As a missionary, we start in that sense with our lives and our hearts, but even our money as well. The Lord, he tests us, he proves us. And when we're faithful with a little, then he can make us we can be faithful with much. He doesn't usually start with much, and he starts with a little. And that's what Deputation really is. Like, you can prove yourself with the Lord that you're going to be faithful, not only take care of the needs of your family to set aside for the future, and but also be generous. As Josh mentioned, opportunities to help other missionaries. If the Lord has blessed you, and he blessed Josh, he blessed I on Deputation, I know there were many opportunities where we saw people who weren't blessed yet, or weren't nearly as blessed. And I know both cases we reached out and helped people, and the Lord will only give you more opportunities to do that. And so, as Josh says, money's a tool, and Deputation is the first step in learning how to use that tool in your ministry.
That's right. Well, keep at it. If you're on Deputation, if you're a member of a church, pray for missionaries as they are raising support and seeking to glorify God in the mission field that God's called them to accomplish. Well, we'll continue these conversations on finances and missions. I hope you'll continue to tune in. This is Josh Mead here in cold, snowy Michigan.
And Erik Johnson in the cold DR.
God bless. Have a great week.